History doesn't bury its darkest stories. It just stops talking about them. This is the medical grimoire, where medicine, history, and darkness meet. I'm your narrator, and tonight we go back. Tonight we are still in the Renaissance, an age of bold ideas, extraordinary ambition, and experiments that modern medicine would consider unthinkable. Tonight someone connects a tube between a lamb and a living man and opens the valve. The lamb was alive. That was important. The blood had to be warm, fresh, still moving through a living animal when it entered the human body. That was the theory, at least. The patient was a 15-year-old boy. He had been described as mentally disturbed, prone to fits of mania that left him exhausted and incoherent. His physicians had tried everything they knew. Nothing had worked. And so in Paris in 1667, a physician named Jean-Baptiste Denis proposed something that had never been attempted on a human being in any documented medical history. He would replace the boy's corrupted blood with the pure, gentle blood of a lamb. He would connect the two bodies with a silver tube. He would let the animal's blood flow directly into the child's veins, and the boy survived. He recovered. He was, by the accounts of those present, calmer and clearer than he had been in months. It was one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of medicine. And it was the beginning of a catastrophe that would set blood transfusion back by nearly 200 years. Welcome to the medical grimoire. Tonight we follow the blood. To understand the first transfusions, you need to understand what 17th century physicians believed about blood, and how recently that understanding had been overturned. In 1628, just 4 decades before Denis's experiment in Paris, the English physician William Harvey published his landmark work on the circulation of the blood. Before Harvey, the dominant Galenic view then held that blood was produced continuously in the liver, flowed outward through the body, and was consumed by the tissues. A one-way, slow-moving system with no return journey. Harvey demonstrated through careful experimental observation that the heart was a pump, that blood circulated continuously through a closed loop, and that the total volume of blood in the body was finite and recycled rather than endlessly produced and consumed. Harvey's discovery was revolutionary. It was also almost immediately recognized as opening a door that Galenic medicine had never imagined. If blood circulated, if it moved continuously through vessels that connected the heart to every part of the body, then perhaps it could be moved between bodies too. Perhaps the blood of one creature could be introduced into the vessels of another. Perhaps disease could be washed out of a sick body with the clean blood of a healthy one. The idea spread quickly through the intellectual circles of mid-17th century Europe. In England, the newly founded Royal Society became the center of transfusion experimentation. Robert Boyle drew up a list of experimental questions. What would happen if you transferred blood between animals of different species? Could you alter the character of an animal by replacing its blood? Could you keep an animal alive after removing all its blood by replacing it with another animal's? These were not idle speculations. They were, experimental questions, and the members of the Royal Society set about answering them with the methodical enthusiasm of men who believed they were standing at the edge of a new world. Between 1665 and 1667, a series of animal transfusion experiments were conducted in London, supervised by the physician Richard Lower, that established the basic mechanical feasibility of moving blood between living bodies. Lower's experiments were brutal by modern standards, elegant by the standards of the time. He demonstrated that a dog could be bled nearly to the point of death and then revived by transfusing blood from another dog. He demonstrated cross-species transfusion, amped lamb blood into a dog, and observed that some animals survived it, at least temporarily. He was building a foundation. And once the foundation existed, the leap to human experimentation was, for the physicians of the 1660s, not a question of whether but of when. Jean-Baptiste Denis was a French physician, mathematician, and astronomer, a polymath of the kind that the 17th century seemed to produce with extraordinary regularity. He was ambitious, confident, and absolutely convinced that transfusion represented the next great breakthrough in medicine. He was also working in a competitive environment. He knew that the English physicians at the Royal Society were advancing rapidly, and he was determined that France would not be left behind. His first human transfusion, performed in June 1667, used a 15-year-old patient whose name history has not preserved. The boy had been subjected to repeated bloodlettings, the standard treatment for almost any condition involving altered mental states, and had not improved. Denis chose him as a candidate for transfusion, and the procedure was carried out in front of witnesses, with the careful documentation that Denis knew would be necessary to establish priority and credibility. The setup was precisely what you might imagine from a 17th century surgical theater. The patient restrained but conscious, a lamb beside him, silver tubes connecting the jugular vein of the animal to a vein in the patient's arm. A small amount of blood was removed from the boy first, consistent with the bloodletting theory that bad blood needed to be expelled before good blood could replace it. Then the animal blood was allowed to flow in. Denis described what he observed during the procedure with the careful attention of a man who knows he is writing history. The patient felt warmth spreading up his arm from the entry point of the tube. He reported feeling hot across his back and under his arms. His pulse, which had been irregular, seemed to stabilize. After the procedure, he slept deeply, the first uninterrupted sleep he had reportedly had in weeks. The following day, he was calmer, clearer, apparently improved. Denis was elated. He published an account of the procedure almost immediately, circulating it through the learned networks of European medicine. The Royal Society responded with a mixture of admiration and competitive alarm. Within weeks, Richard Lower and Edmund King had performed the first human transfusion in England, using a volunteer named Arthur Koga, a former divinity student described as mildly deranged, who agreed to receive sheep's blood in exchange for 20 shillings. Koga survived. He reported somewhat grandly that he felt better. He spent part of his payment on alcohol and was seen shortly afterward in a London tavern, apparently in good health and good spirits. The transfusion enthusiasts took this as confirmation. The experiment, they believed, was working. Before we follow the story to its catastrophic conclusion, it is worth pausing to understand why the early transfusion patients survived at all. Because they should not have. Not by any mechanism that the physicians of the 1660s understood, and not by any mechanism that makes immediate intuitive sense even today. Animal blood is incompatible with human blood. The proteins on the surface of animal red blood cells are recognized by the human immune system as foreign, triggering an immediate and potentially lethal immune response. Transfusing significant quantities of lamb or sheep blood into a human being should cause rapid hemolysis, the destruction of red blood cells, followed by kidney failure, shock, and death. And yet the early patients survived. Why? The most likely explanation is volume. The amounts of animal blood actually transferred in these early procedures were very small. In Denis's first case, probably no more than a few ounces. A small enough volume of foreign blood might produce a reaction that was uncomfortable but not lethal. Fever, chills, back pain, dark urine from hemolysis. Symptoms that the patients and physicians of the era would not necessarily have connected to the transfusion itself or would have attributed to other causes. Arthur Koga's survival was likely similar. Small volume, mild reaction. Recovery attributed to the procedure rather than despite it. The early successes were real in the sense that the patients lived. They were misleading in the sense that they suggested the procedure was safe when it was in fact a game of lethal roulette that the players did not know they were playing. What no one understood in 1667, what no one could have understood because the science did not yet exist, was blood typing. The ABO blood group system would not be discovered until 1901 by Karl Landsteiner. Denis and Lower and their colleagues were not ignorant or reckless men. They were working at the very edge of human knowledge. The edge, in this case, had a very sharp drop on the other side. Antoine Mauroy was a French nobleman's servant, described in contemporary accounts as suffering from a severe and persistent mania. Periods of violent, uncontrollable behavior alternating with exhaustion and incoherence. His wife, desperate after years of watching her husband deteriorate, brought him to Jean-Baptiste Denis in the winter of 1667. Denis had now performed several successful transfusions. His confidence was high. He agreed to treat Mauroy. The first transfusion was performed in December 1667. Calf blood this time rather than lamb, in a larger quantity than Denis had previously used. Mauroy survived the first procedure. He was, according to Denis's account, calmer afterward. His wife reported improvement. Denis treated this as further confirmation of his theory. Several weeks later, when Mauroy's symptoms returned, Denis performed a second transfusion. This time something was different. During the infusion of the calf blood, Mauroy began to sweat profusely. He reported pain along his arm, spreading into his back. His pulse became rapid and irregular. He felt an intense heat across his entire body. He vomited. His urine, when he was able to produce it, was dark, almost black. These were the classic signs of a severe hemolytic transfusion reaction. The immune system attacking and destroying the incompatible blood cells, releasing their contents into the bloodstream, overwhelming the kidneys with a flood of hemoglobin that turned the urine the color of dark wine. Denis recognized that something had gone wrong, but did not understand what or why. He stopped the transfusion. He waited. Mauroy appeared to stabilize. He slept. Denis, relieved, left for the night. When Denis returned the following morning, Mauroy was dead. The aftermath was immediate and catastrophic for the future of blood transfusion. Mauroy's wife filed a complaint against Denis, accusing him of causing her husband's death. The case went to the Paris courts. The court ultimately ruled inconclusively, neither condemning Denis nor fully exonerating him. But the damage was done. The French Parliament effectively banned human blood transfusion in 1670. The Royal Society in England went quiet on the subject. Across Europe, the enthusiasm that had built so rapidly over the previous 3 years collapsed almost overnight. The experiment was over. It would not be seriously attempted again for nearly 150 years. The gap between Antoine Mauroy's death in 1668 and the next serious chapter of transfusion medicine spans almost the entirety of the 18th century. It is a silence worth examining because it tells us something important about how medicine responds to catastrophic failure. The problem was not simply that transfusion had killed a patient. Medicine killed patients regularly. Surgery, bloodletting, purging. The treatments of the era were dangerous by modern standards, and patient deaths were not unusual events. The problem was that transfusion had killed a patient in a way that was public, documented, contested in court, and associated with an experiment that had been presented as a triumph. The fall from triumph to scandal was too steep and too visible to survive. There was also a deeper problem. No one understood why it had gone wrong. Denis and his contemporaries could observe that some patients survived and some died, but they had no conceptual framework for understanding the difference. Without that understanding, there was no way to make the procedure reliably safe. And without reliability, there was no ethical justification for continuing to experiment on human beings. This is, in a way, one of the earliest examples of what we would today call a moratorium on a medical technology, a collective decision to stop, not because the underlying idea was wrong, but because the knowledge needed to pursue it safely did not yet exist. The physicians who abandoned transfusion in the 1670s were not being cowardly or unscientific. They were being, in the most fundamental sense, responsible. They had found the edge of what they could safely do, and they stepped back from it. The knowledge would come eventually. It always does. But it would take another century and a half, and the development of entirely new fields of science before anyone would be ready to try again. The man who brought transfusion back was a British obstetrician named James Blundell, and the problem that drove him to it was one of the most devastating in all of medicine. Postpartum hemorrhage, the catastrophic bleeding, that killed women in childbirth at a rate that Blundell, who delivered babies for a living, found intolerable. Blundell had watched women bleed to death on his table. He had watched it happen knowing that there was nothing in his medical toolkit that could replace the blood they were losing. Transfusion, the failed experiment of the previous century, began to seem to him not like a reckless gamble, but like a logical necessity, because the alternative was certain death, and any chance was better than none. His critical insight was one that Denis and Lower had not made. Animal blood was the problem. The failures of the 17th century had involved transfusing the blood of lambs and calves into human patients. Blundell reasoned, correctly, though for reasons he could not fully articulate, that human blood should be used for human patients. He began experimenting in 1818 using human donors and performed his first clinical transfusion in September of that year on a man dying of stomach cancer. The patient died, but not immediately and not obviously from the transfusion. Over the next decade, Blundell performed 10 transfusions, 5 of which he considered successful. The patients who benefited were almost all women hemorrhaging in childbirth, exactly the cases he had designed the procedure for. His survival rates were not impressive by modern standards, but in the context of patients who would otherwise certainly have died, any survival was extraordinary. Blundell published his results, refined his equipment, and argued publicly for the legitimacy of the approach. He did not solve the underlying problem of blood compatibility. Some of his patients survived by luck. Their donors happened to be compatible. Others died from reactions that Blundell attributed to technical complications rather than immunological ones. But he had proven, more rigorously than anyone before him, that blood transfusion between human beings was possible and that it could save lives. The rest, the blood typing, the anticoagulants, the blood banks, the global infrastructure of modern transfusion medicine, would follow, slowly, painfully, over the next century. But it would follow. The history of blood transfusion is, in many ways, a compressed version of the history of medicine itself. The cycle of bold idea, premature application, catastrophic failure, long silence, slow return, and eventual mastery. It is a cycle that has repeated itself across almost every major medical innovation, from antisepsis to anesthesia to organ transplantation. What makes the transfusion story particularly striking is how clearly it illustrates the gap between mechanical feasibility and biological understanding. Denis and Lower knew how to move blood between bodies. They had the tubes, the technical skill, the nerve. What they lacked was the knowledge of why some blood could safely enter some bodies and not others. Knowledge that required an entirely different level of biological science than existed in the 17th century. Karl Landsteiner's discovery of the ABO blood group system in 1901 was not a dramatic experiment performed under pressure. It was quiet, methodical laboratory work, mixing blood samples from different individuals and observing which ones caused clumping, which ones did not. The result was a simple, elegant system. 4 blood types, defined by the presence or absence of 2 antigens on the surface of red blood cells, with corresponding antibodies in the plasma that would attack and destroy cells carrying the wrong antigens. This discovery made safe transfusion possible for the first time. It also explained, retroactively, every death that transfusion had caused since Denis's experiments in Paris, explained why Antoine Mauroy had died while the 15-year-old boy had survived. The answer had been in the blood all along. It had taken 230 years to read it. Today, blood transfusion is one of the most common medical procedures in the world. Approximately 118 million units of blood are donated globally every year. In the United States alone, someone receives a blood transfusion every 2 seconds. The procedure that killed Antoine Mauroy in 1668 now saves millions of lives annually, reliably, safely, with a well-understood system of typing, cross-matching, and compatibility testing that makes transfusion reactions rare and lethal ones rarer still. It is easy, looking at that number, so 118 million units per year, to forget what it took to get there. The dogs bled to the edge of death in Richard Lower's laboratory. The 15-year-old boy with the silver tube in his arm, warmth spreading up through his veins. The lamb beside him still breathing. Antoine Mauroy, sweating and vomiting and dying in the night. And his wife standing over the body, trying to find someone to blame for what medicine had done to her husband. James Blundell watching women bleed out in childbirth, decade after decade, until he couldn't watch it anymore, and went back to the experiment that had killed a man 150 years before him. Landsteiner in his quiet laboratory mixing blood samples, noticing the clumping, writing down what it meant. Every one of those moments was necessary. Not in the sense that they were inevitable or that the suffering was justified by the outcome, but in the sense that the knowledge accumulated through them, layer by layer, failure by failure, until there was enough of it to do the thing safely. The blood that flows through a transfusion bag today carries the weight of all of that history. The boy and the lamb, the dying man and the physician who did not fully understand what he had done, the long silence of the 18th century, the slow return. Medicine rarely arrives cleanly. It comes through the dark, carrying what it has learned from the dead, trying to keep the living alive long enough to learn something more. That's the story of the first transfusions. The lamb blood, the silver tubes, the death that shut the experiment down for nearly 2 centuries, and the long road back to the procedure that now saves millions of lives every year. From the boy who survived to Antoine Mauroy who didn't. From Denis's silver tube to Landsteiner's blood types. From a lamb tied beside a patient's bed to 118 million units of donated blood every year. The archive never closes. Next episode this week.